Check, check. Good evening.
Hi, Glenn.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, Mariska.
Hi, Glenn. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
Hi, good evening.
Evening, Alita.
How are you?
Well,
So it was interesting. What my sister sent was intellect versus wisdom.
yeah.
It just kind of, some of the things
Interesting, huh?
make sense.
Yeah, very much. Okay, so we've just gone 6:30, so we can begin. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryankarvavahe Tejasvinavadidhamastu Mavitvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay, so we are continuing with chapter 11. So we're currently in chapter 11 of the Vedanta Treaties. So a very brief recap on the text of this particular chapter thus far, just so that we get an idea of the thought flow. He's talking about the states of consciousness. So he describes the waking, dream, and deep sleep states that we all go through. And through an analysis of those three states, we derive the fourth state. So he describes this as pure consciousness. The Sanskrit word is turiya, which literally means fourth. And it is said to be our true self, our true identity, our essential self. So the way that we've understood the idea of an essential self is to compare it to the idea of non-essential selves. And so you may say, yes, I'm a mother, but I'm not only a mother. Yes, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not only a lawyer. Yes, I'm a student, but I'm not only a student. You've got all of these different roles that you occupy, and not a single one of them completely defines who and what you are. So they're not essential in that sense, that they don't entirely pervade all of your personality. So when we use this word essence, we mean something that pervades the entire aspect of it. So the essence of sugar is sweetness. There's no bit of sugar which is bitter and the rest is sweet. Sweetness pervades the whole thing. The essence of water is wetness. It's not that there's little bits of dry water lying around somewhere. No, water pervades everywhere. That's its essence. So what is the essential identity that we each have? It's the one that pervades everything. So that's what he means by the fourth state of consciousness. And he says that the purpose of human life, really, but more sort of narrower than that, the purpose of this text is to, and the purpose of the study and practice of it is to allow us to experience that essential self as our true identity. So that's the practice of spirituality. So the thing that we covered in last class was what he calls the assurance of Vedanta, which is to say that for everybody, it is possible to achieve that recognition of their essential self. And to that end, he described the path to get there. So what's very interesting, of course, is that what does he use to describe the path to get to the fourth state, to get to one's essential self? He uses some English poetry. So the poem, The Daffodils, describes the path to get to the reality. And we touched last week on the beginning of it, but I'm going to start again from the beginning just for the sense of completeness. So any quick questions before we get into the poem? Okay, so let's go to the poem, The Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high or veils and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Okay. So what he's describing here is the three self-development disciplines: the path of action for the body, which is selfless service; the path of devotion for the mind, which is gratitude and wonder; and the path of knowledge for the intellect, which is inquiry, reflection, and meditation. So the first of these is the path of action. So he has this phrase here, I wandered lonely as a cloud. So we have three aspects here that he is touching on: wandering, lonely, and cloud. So when we think of wandering, you think of a Bedouin, someone who wanders through the desert with no fixed abode. You can imagine the romanticized version of that. It's not just that the Bedouin doesn't have a fixed abode. There's also no feeling of, I wish I had a home to go back to. Now, maybe the Bedouins did have that in some sense, but you imagine that Bedouin who just walks through the desert from place to place without any fixed location to call their home. But nor is there a feeling of lack. I don't lack a home. So when he says wandering, it implies this feeling of not needing to have a fixed place that you call your home, meaning your bricks and mortar, that sort of thing. Or even your country. You could say, my home. I've been living abroad for 15 years. I'd love to go back home. You use that phrase to mean your country. So it means having no attachment to a particular place. So this is the first aspect of selfless service, not being attached to place. Second aspect is lonely. So lonely, again, the image is of someone who is physically alone, but not pining away for company. Lonely means with yourself. with your own company and being just fine with that. So it means not having a dependency on others for a sense of stability, for a sense of well-being. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't enjoy others' company and gain a sense of benefit from community. But it doesn't mean we have that dependence where if we don't have people around us, we suffer. So lonely has this implication of not being attached to people or to persons. So this is the state that the person's in mentally. No attachment to location, no attachment to person. But of course, the person could still be kind of a nuisance. No, the person's wandering and lonely as a cloud. So of course, the question is, what does a cloud do? It provides rain. And without that, there's no food. Without that, there's no life. So we receive life from the cloud. And not only does the cloud give us this gift of life, but in doing so, it actually gives itself away. And so it's the ultimate in service and sacrifice. It's not only serving the good of others, but in doing so, I am diminished until I no longer exist. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Perfectly, beautifully describing the path of action. Bhagavad-Gita has 43 verses trying to describe the path of action. Does a beautiful job of it, of course. But here, much more succinct, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Now, did the poet know what he was talking about? Who knows? It doesn't matter. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect of the path of action is the way that we can actually practice it. So when it comes to doing that, it means having a correct assessment of who we are and where we are. So why is this important? So the example that we've given in the last couple of classes, let's say you are at a family dinner, Christmas or Thanksgiving or Hanukkah or whatever it happens to be. And you are an in-law child. You're a daughter-in-law, you're a son-in-law. And your parents-in-law or someone at the dinner table says something that is off-color, offensive. Now the question is, what's your obligation there? Well, the first thing you need to ask is, well, who am I here? So contrast the same situation where now it's the same Thanksgiving dinner, but you're at your biological parents' place. Now somebody says something that is off-color and offensive. You have a much wider latitude for action when it's your own home where you grew up compared to, say, the in-laws. Now, that may not always be the case, of course. We're just painting an example here. So you could imagine why that's the case. Well, you have a different status in those two separate environments. You are the same person, but your status there is different. And so you may be much more free in your own home to say, hey, you can't talk like that. Have a civil tongue while we're eating, whatever. When you're at your in-laws' place, you might recognize that you don't really have the authority to push your opinions out. So you know you have to reserve yourself. So this is why it's important to first ask this question, who am I in this situation? This is what Arjuna did not ask himself on the battlefield, because he was the leader of a righteous army engaged in a righteous battle that serves the community. He didn't ask himself that question. If he had answered it that way, he wouldn't have needed Krishna's advice. So once we've understood where we are and who we are in that environment, we say, well, what can I offer? How can I serve? And that simply comes down to your own intellectual assessment of the situation. Who's here? What do they need? What is it that I can offer to the environment that I'm in? And what is my obligation? So when you are a son-in-law, to stay with the example, your obligation is to remain quiet, because you'll just inflame things and make things worse for your poor wife. When you are at your own home, your obligation is to speak up. So what your obligation is determined by your own intellect, your own thinking, but it's based on who you are and what the environment is and what you have to offer. What can I do to make this situation better? What can I do to enhance this person's well-being? So this is important because, as the phrase down here says, no man can serve two masters. So this is from the New Testament. You cannot serve simultaneously an ideal for service and selfishness. They are like the angel and the devil. You can only listen to one or the other. So when we consciously ask these questions with sincerity, then what we're doing is focusing our attention on the ideal, and then the principle, as you think, so you become, then functions, and we grow into that less egocentric perspective. Because when we are not functioning towards the ideal, the tendency is to function towards our own selfish demands. So this is, as you might want to put it, the practice of the path of action. So what's the effect of the path of action? Because we are reducing ego and selfishness, we experience greater mental peace. So this is one of the assertions of Vedanta. So this is something that we need to be able to check for ourselves and see if it makes sense for us, is that the cause of our mental agitation is ego and selfishness. As we reduce and diminish that, then naturally our mental agitation diminishes, we find greater mental peace. So this is described in the line that floats on high o'er vales and hills. So you can imagine the ups and downs of life, symbolized by the vales and hills of the landscape. If you are in a vehicle on the road, then you go up and down with the terrain. If you are in, say, a hot air balloon, even if it's only a few feet above the ground, then when the hills and valleys go up and down, you don't. You stay even. So you have that evenness of mind, even while you go through the different changing scenarios of life. So one of the questions we had in a class yesterday was how to manage the anxiety associated with the COVID-19 crisis. Start to look for a way to help in any way you can, anywhere you can. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it is directed genuinely towards wanting to improve the lot of others. This is what you might call positive psychology. And so this becomes a way to manage our agitation. It doesn't necessarily change our environment perfectly, but it does change the way that we relate to it. So we cease to personalize everything. We don't make everything all about us anymore. And so that means we rise above challenges, that idea of floating over vales and hills. Okay, any clarifications to the path of action? So then he moves on now to the path of devotion. So devotion is the unifying feeling of love that he describes. So when we use this word devotion, it means love. The distinction between love and devotion is only with regards to whether or not the object is equal or lower or higher. So when the object of our affection is equal to us, we say, I love. When the object of our identification is higher than us, we say, I am devoted to. And so that's why you would say, I love my siblings, I love my children, I love my car, I love my job. But you might say, I'm devoted to my guru. I'm devoted to God. I'm devoted to my parents. So you use this word devotion when the object is higher. And so when we talk about higher, we can simply think of it as less egocentric, less centered around my own identity. So this is essentially what we mean by love. Love is identity with, or identification with, another being, say. So that means that you have recognized a oneness between the two of you. It's unifying. So the problem with that, if it's only for one person, then when you look at others, then there's no unity there. So you might have a feeling of unity with, say, your own family, parents, children, siblings. But when it comes to other people, then there's no unifying feeling of love. You're not unified with them. And so what we want to do is to take whatever love we do have, that feeling of unity, and expand it ever outwards. So there's a beautiful quote he has in the Vedanta Treaties. He says, "Your home, therefore, should be the center and not the boundary of your affection. Let it be the center from which it spreads out, out, out." And so this is what the path of devotion is describing. It's describing that universal feeling of love, identification with. So it means identifying the emotions with something higher. So the path of devotion, that feeling of love, that appreciation for that beauty, is described when he says, "When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." So you can imagine he's walking along and all of a sudden this beautiful vista of the daffodils opens up in front of him. And there's this wash of beauty that comes over him. And he's struck with wonder and awe at the beauty of it. In that moment, his ego is just suspended. There's that unifying feeling of love. What's he found unity with? The beauty of the daffodils. And to say he's found unity means that he's part of it too. So it's not necessarily even I am enjoying the daffodils, it's the daffodils. And so the ego is broken down here. So this is achieved through the path of action. You go through that path of action, you keep dissolving the ego through selfless service, and there is this rush, this unifying feeling of love. And it's highlighted here when he says, "When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." So he says, devotion is therefore directly related to one's love for fellow beings. So what it means is that the moment you have identification with the higher, the lower is automatically embraced. So what's a good analogy for this? We used this last time. You're at a family reunion and there's a big photograph, all 45 of you who are still alive. Everyone's happy and all the rest of it. And then someone walks in, a woman about your age, maybe a few years older, comes in and she says, "Excuse me, here's my DNA test, here's my driver's license, I'm your long lost sister." Of course, the proof is there. What happens the moment you see that person? You clasp them and grab them, and then we've got another person for the family photograph, you know. There's an immediate sense of oneness there because there is an identification with the higher, which is the family unit. So the family is seen as a single whole. It's higher, and every individual is embraced by that family unit. So when I have love for the family unit, the higher, immediately everybody within that unit is embraced, even if I don't know them. My cousin on the other side of the world, whom I've never seen, never met, never even seen a picture, immediately I love him the moment he's born. This is an experience many of us have probably already had. The idea is to say then that if you claim love for God, the highest, then you will immediately embrace everything lower than that, which means all of its creation, with love. So to claim love for God but hate for any one part of the creation, it's a mockery. It doesn't make sense. And so this is the path to get there. Express continuously your love for fellow beings, and that boundary gets pushed wider and wider and wider. And we get that unifying feeling of devotion that flows into that space. So as we said, the essence of devotion is the reduction or the effacement of the ego. That little self, it's all about me. That's what gets wiped away. And there are different ways that we can achieve it. So again, now getting into the idea of the practice, one of the ways is to attune to the wonder of nature, the beauty of the natural world. And this is exactly what we're seeing in the Daffodils. It does not necessarily look like a religious poem or a spiritual poem, but that's what we've got. It's a spiritual experience. So there's a beautiful quote in the Bhagavad-Gita. He talks about this. He says, though unknown, one can tune in to the divinity in the world by feeling the wonder of nature. So that's in chapter 2, verse 29. So when you feel the wonder of nature, and we say feel, we don't mean sit there and analyze, sunlight hits the chlorophyll molecule and it jumps off an electron and so forth. Although that too, if you have that temperament, that can elicit feelings of beauty when you see the way that it functions. But the point is, whatever your mode of observation is, by attuning to the wonder of nature, we get that rush of that feeling of devotion. So it's characterized by the loss or the suspension of the ego. So you start to perceive an underlying intelligence there. How does a blade of grass grow out? Why are the proportions of the natural world maintained so beautifully? How does it all function? You cut yourself and immediately it starts to heal. You can't stop it, you can't start it, you don't know how it happens. So you start to see an underlying intelligence, which is part of you as well, or which you are a part of, functioning in the natural world. And we don't know or understand what it is. And so the mind feels that and the intellect surrenders. I don't know. So tuning into the wonder of nature can help elicit this feeling. There are other ways as well. A religious affiliation. So if you have already some religious affiliation where the singing or the rituals have that sense of awe and wonder associated with them, then by all means, use it for the same purpose. Community singing in general doesn't have to be a religious affair. You can sit around singing folk songs that are, that have that universal theme. Community singing allows that for that release of emotion, and it's a shared experience. So you're connecting with others. You have to be in harmony with them. You have to be in unison with them. You have to be in time with them. So you tune in to something outside yourself. And etc. Simply means there are more than just these ways of getting into that feeling of wonder and that feeling of the beauty. So the next part of the poem, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched a never-ending line along the margin of the bay, and so on and so on. He's talking here about just an outward gush of emotion. He's just relentlessly almost expressing his appreciation and the beauty that he saw and that he has imbibed and that is flowing through him. So there's no real philosophy that we can draw from this aspect, except to say that this is the effect on his personality, to express it outwards. And again, everybody expresses that feeling in different ways. You take a Swami Ramatirtha. So that was expressed in his written poetry and his very authentic public discourses. You have Swami Parthasarathy, whose sense of devotion expressed through creating a school and creating an online course. You have the Saint Tyagaraja, who expressed through creating song and singing and singing and singing. The point is there is this outward expression of this devotion. So this brings up, or this segues into the next aspect, which is the path of knowledge. So any queries on that before we move on there? Okay, so any emotion can be either expressed outwardly or internalized. So you can think of it as spending or reinvesting. So when we have the capacity to internalize an emotion, then by analogy, it's a little bit like thinking of it as a battery. Right? So let's say you have a feeling of love for a partner, for a friend, for whatever it is, and you just can't stop yourself. You have to say it. You say it outwardly. Okay, you've discharged that feeling that was in you. Another way to do it is to internalize it and retain it so that it's less like a discharged battery and more like a glowing ember. Something which you retain and which you can draw from, if you like, more slowly. So there's different ways that we can relate to our emotions. So the problem with the idea of internalizing an emotion, of course, is that it can become suppression. And so this is why we need a certain amount of expression. We have to express to a certain degree, because if we don't allow it to express, then it becomes a suppression. So this again is the balance that the clear intellect must determine. What is my appropriate level of expression, which if I don't do becomes suppression, and what is an appropriate level of internalization? So the way to internalize the emotion is through analysis. And so this is indicated by I gazed and gazed. How is it indicated here? The coming to know of anything is achieved when we place our attention on it. So think of it from a visual perspective. You want to know what your new puppy is like. What do? You put him in the middle of the floor or the yard or the beach and you just let him run and you watch. You watch him play with other dogs, you watch him play with a ball, etc. You gaze upon it, and in gazing upon it, you come to know it. So that's the idea. And of course, we don't just gaze with our eyes, we gaze with our intellects, which means that we look out upon ideas and concepts and meaning and patterns, and we gaze on them, and we come to know something intellectually. We come to understand it. So that is the process of analysis. Analysis is the process by which we gaze upon things to come to know and understand them as concepts. So what's happening is now that the intellect is comprehending the mind's emotion. It's creating, if you like, a conceptual structure to describe what that feeling is. And there's a way that we can sort of start to understand it in here. He says, it's like your first view of Everest. You might gaze upon that thing from base camp or from wherever it is you can see it. And the majesty and the size of it just totally overwhelms you. And you say, I never understood this beauty before now. What beauty are you talking about? The beauty of the Himalayas. You read about it, you saw the pictures, you thought you knew it, how breathtaking it was. But when you're standing in front of it, something else happens. You understand it. Aha, it clicks into place. Now I know what they were all talking about. So the intellect clicks. Aha, I understand what this emotion is. And there's a joy that comes from that. Intellectual joy comes from comprehending and understanding something, appreciating it in that way. So when we reflect upon what has been experienced, then the intellect comes to comprehend it. Not only does it comprehend it, but it recognizes it as a worthwhile object. So how often do we come back to this quote from Martin Luther King? The purpose of education is to not just develop the power of concentration, but to develop worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. It means discriminating what is a worthy object for my attention. My physical attention, so that means through the senses. My emotional attention, the sort of emotions I am entertaining, the sort of thoughts I am entertaining. Is it worth spending my attention on these? So the intellect recognizes that bhakti, that devotion for what it is, and recognizes this is healthy. This is good for me. And so when the intellect says, yes, this is a beautiful object for our attention, and when the mind naturally likes it because it feels so good, then you have this harmony, this confluence of mind and intellect. They're both working towards the same goal, one from a conceptual perspective and the other from an emotional perspective. They're both expressing the same quality. So as far as our daily practice, what does it mean? It means investigating what is the truth, what is real. And we had an earlier quote from Martin Luther King. We can also describe the distinction between facts and truth. So I don't know if this is his formulation, but he puts it very beautifully. He says that a fact is the absence of contradiction. The truth is the presence of coherence. And so he describes it in the context of the civil rights struggle of African Americans. And he says it is a fact that we have come a long way. So when you compare it to, say, some of the Supreme Court judgments that had passed 100 or 150 years earlier, to where they are now in the 1950s, they have come a long way. It's a fact. But he says, while there's no contradiction there, it doesn't tell the whole truth. There's some coherence missing. He says, if we only look at that fact, then we may fall prey to a dangerous optimism and not realize the deeper truth, which is, yes, but we still have a long way to go. And so the truth is the presence of a cohering, intelligent understanding that links facts together. That's truth. And there are different levels, if you like, of truth in terms of subtlety and so forth. So the path of knowledge is to first of all look for facts, things that you can't dispute, and then truth, which is deeper meaning. And then beyond truth, there is understanding. So the word understanding can mean a range of different things. Here we'll talk about it in terms of that truth that you have understood actually becomes part of your personality, and it now modifies naturally the way that you react and respond to the world, your attitudes and your behaviors. So then you have an understanding of it, not just an intellectual or an intelligence-based appreciation that you can repeat the words, and you have a conceptual understanding of it, but it's not real for you, within you as a subject. So what is factual, what is true, and what is real? So this is why we talk about the daily study and reflection being so important, because we are making this philosophical inquiry into truth and reality. And so we are identifying with those concepts in the same way that earlier on the mind was identifying with the beauty of nature. So here the intellect is identifying with the truth of these concepts and striving to find truth. The same principle functions: as you think, so you become. So you grow into that understanding the more we reflect. So often you may hear the idea that experience brings wisdom. So we would say, no, experience does not bring wisdom. Experience gives you a lot of material for reflection, but it is the reflection that brings wisdom, not the experience per se. If that were the case, then we wouldn't need self-help books. We wouldn't need philosophies to improve our lives. We just need to have experiences. And every time we have an experience, we keep gaining wisdom. Doesn't happen. Some very experienced people are also very wise. Some very experienced people are not. And so the practice for us is the daily study of the higher values of life. So higher values simply means these greater truths. What he talks about as reflecting upon the subtlety of life. So something is more subtle when it pervades more widely. And so these principles that underlie human experience pervade all of human experience. And so they are more pervasive, more subtle. So as far as the practice goes, we always try to bring it as early in the morning as possible. So the ideal time, according to the texts, is between 4 and 6 a.m. And if you speak to those who have consistently applied their study at that time, you'll get testimonies that yes, once you get accustomed to that early morning hour, that period of the day is very much more conducive for intellectual reflection than middle of the day, evening, and so forth. So getting up early is difficult, especially that 4 to 6. So what we can look to do is to make it as early as possible and rearrange a few things within your schedule if you can. So if you know, for example, that you tend to spend 20 minutes a day on your emails, generally, not long after I've got up, on my Facebook or my Instagram, whatever. Say, fine, I can do that, but let's do it a couple of hours from now. So you've got 20 minutes. You've just got yourself 20 minutes for your study. You should maybe be able to get up 15 minutes earlier. So that makes it 35 minutes. See if you can grab 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, and move those things for later in the day. Give yourself 45 minutes to an hour to just reflect upon these ideas. So it means finding a philosophical text and going through the process of study and reflection, which itself has a whole host of different things we can say about it, ways to do it, ways to approach it, and so forth. So that is the path of knowledge for the intellect. So we have the path of action, in which we're identifying with the needs of others, and so suspending our ego. We've got the path of devotion, which is identifying with that unifying principle in the natural world. And you have the path of knowledge, which is the intellect identifying with higher principles. As you think, so you become, through all three channels of the personality. You grow in the direction away from your ego, away from your immaturity. Okay, now where does that lead us? Any questions before we move on to the next?
Glenn?
Yeah.
So is it like a progression that you move from the path of action to path of devotion to path of knowledge? Or are they three distinct paths that you take, one based on your nature? Or can someone simultaneously practice all three?
Yeah, really good questions. So your first one, first I'll take your last one. Every person should simultaneously practice all three. The only difference is in the proportion. So if you are more intellectual, analytical, then you should do more of the path of knowledge as your sadhana, your spiritual practice. If you are more emotional in nature, then you should do slightly more of devotion. And to the extent that you have a lot of desires bubbling in your personality, to that extent, you should get engaged in action through the path of action. So depending upon your temperament, you will apportion the three disciplines accordingly. So you think of them like nutritional supplements. I've got a heavy iron deficiency because I've been a vegan for 45 years. I've got a little bit of a vitamin D deficiency. I don't go outside enough. So the correct proportion of each one. The idea of whether or not you progress and whether or not you start with action, they all lead into each other. If you start anywhere, then you will naturally also start to improve and naturally gravitate to one of the other disciplines as well. So this is showing us a way to get into that cycle. So if you look at chapter 12, for example, when he describes the three of them, he first of all describes the path of devotion. Then he describes the path of knowledge. Then he describes the path of action. So what's this describing? Well, we could say that he's saying that everything starts with humility of I don't know. Only when you recognize I don't know, which is that surrendering of the ego, can you then take in knowledge. So you start with the path of devotion to surrender, then you take in knowledge to fortify your understanding, and then you apply that knowledge in the path of action. Devotion, then knowledge, then action. Here he's saying if you forget all that stuff, just start serving the world, just start helping everywhere you can. What will happen is that you'll face the ego outwards, and then the devotion rushes in, so you catch that and work with that, run with that wave, and then finally you analyze what's going on and you consolidate your understanding. Okay, again, you can make up anything, any narrative you like. So they each will lead into each other, break into the cycle anywhere you can. So this gives a great way to think about it. Just start with action. The VT gives a different way to think about it. Start with devotion and then move to knowledge.
Thank you. That makes it really clear.
Okay. So the next step is meditation. And so he describes meditation. The definition is single-pointed concentration upon a chosen thought to the exclusion of all other thought. So the word meditation means a range of different things, of course, depending upon where you're hearing it. It can mean, for example, the breath exercises that people often do. People talk about walking meditation. It can be described as simply sitting and passively observing the eruption of thought from your mind. So it's got all of these different connotations. So when the word is used here, it has only this very, very strict definition. So this is what we mean when we use the word. It means converging the mind down to a single thought. So at the moment, what are our thoughts like? They're scattered in all directions. We're thinking about work, social life, friends, romance, study, parents, COVID, anxiety, all directions the mind is going. The process of the three spiritual disciplines removes that egocentric perspective, diminishes the selfishness, reduces the agitation. So we bring the thoughts down now. So you can think of maybe bringing it down to, say, the size of a dartboard, whereas earlier it was going in all directions. Then we bring it down even further, and it's just a single target. Bullseye every time, bullseye, 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 every single time. This is meditation, to the exclusion of all other thought. And he means that strictly and literally. There's no other thought occurring. So in the process of meditation, you bring the mind down to that absolute minimum agitation, and then that thought itself is extinguished, leaving no thought. And in that state of a perfectly calm mind without any agitation, your real self is reflected. So by analogy, you're at a park and there's a pond, but there's a gusting breeze rippling it. And when you look down over the surface of the water, your image is distorted. Your face is wobbly and out of shape and out of color. So in the same way, when our mind is agitated, the self in us is reflected, distorted. And so we have all of these false identities, the different selves that are not our essence. As the mind gets calmer, the self appears to us more faithfully. And just as when the wind dies down, there is a much more faithful reflection of our own face back to us. And in a perfectly calm pond, it's a perfectly accurate reflection of what your face looks like. And even though you see it there on the surface, you intuitively and immediately recognize it here as being myself. In the exact same way that if when the water finally clears, you see that you've got a piece of salad on your face from lunch and no one told you about it, the moment you see it in the water there, you don't reach to clear it away there. You immediately know it is here. So too in a perfectly calm mind, when that self is reflected there, it's known subjectively here. You gain that identity of turiya. So this is the process of meditation. And so he describes that as in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So it leads on from the previous part of the stanza. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So that path of knowledge, that reflection, telescopes into contemplation and then meditation. So he says he is vacant and pensive. Interesting, because vacant means no thought and pensive means with thought. So the way we can understand this is that there's no thought of anything for the world. There's no grasping or wanting. The mind is not scattered seeking things externally. So it's completely empty from any kind of egocentric seeking. That thought totally gone. And yet there is that pensive attitude towards the thought of the reality, the self, that final chosen thought. So this is what he's talking about when he says they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So that beauty returns back to him. It flashes upon that inner eye, the eye of wisdom, as it's sometimes called, which is the bliss of solitude. So solitude, again, does not refer to being alone. Solitude refers to the attitude of being with oneself. So you can attain solitude in amongst a house full of people who can't leave. How do you do it? You withdraw your attention into yourself. Now, that doesn't mean that you become an isolationist. So in the same way that we talked about internalizing emotions can have a dark side to it, so can this. The dark side of withdrawing your attention from the external world is that we become emotionally and intellectually isolated from others. And that is going to be damaging for our well-being. So this is why the consistent practice of the three disciplines is so important. While you're withdrawing your attention to stay sane, you also practice service, which means you have to connect to other people. You have to connect to their needs. So you have to maintain that balance. But nonetheless, solitude is this capacity to be with ourselves and be with ourselves comfortably. So you think of it, you come home and you live alone, and what's the first thing you do? Radio goes on, NPR, let's see what's on NPR, or television or music, or magazine opens up, whatever. Why? It's for company. I mean, you've probably heard people say this. I turn the radio on, I like the company. You can't have a conversation, but nonetheless, you need that sense of another presence. So we earn that solitude by consistently applying the three disciplines. So solitude means being with oneself, the bliss of solitude. So in the context here, it means that that recognition of that beauty flashes upon the inward eye, that perfectly calm mind, and there is the bliss of solitude, the bliss that comes from being with your capital S self. And it's that moment of cessation of mind and meditation that brings human perfection. Remember, this is the path to reality. He says, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So the poet becomes one with the daffodils. Where? When he's lying on his couch at home. Why? Because that beauty is within him. He doesn't need the external world to find that beauty, it's within him. I don't need the external world to find that stability and that peace of mind, it's within me, it's perfect, it's already there. So he becomes one with the daffodils means that the individual becomes one with the self. And that is the total removal of the ego. It totally drops. And now that circle of feeling of love and identification, it's no longer a circle. It doesn't have a boundary. It popped. There's no sense of separation, no enmity, no us and them anymore, just us. So it's that oneness with the totality. So not only have we identified with our own essential self, but we've also recognized that that is the essence of everything. And so we identify with everything. There's that feeling of oneness with the totality. Okay, any clarifications to anything there? Okay, so for those who have the text, this is the last portion of chapter 11 of the text. So I'll leave you to read the last few paragraphs after the daffodils for those that have the text. We touched on it last week a little bit, and we may just review it at the beginning of next class, but it describes everything that we just touched on in this session here. So since that's the end of the chapter, we'll leave it there, and we'll begin with chapter 12 next week. So just a little segue into that. What chapter 12 does is it takes those three disciplines as he's described briefly there and gives a much more thorough description of what they are, how they arise, what their underlying principles are, and how we can practice them. He also gives a really good description of why it's so important for us to analyze our temperament first. So for those of you that are doing the Sunday morning class, that's what we're currently doing. We just began with the personality chart. So that personality chart is a way of analyzing our temperament, our sattva, rajas, and tamas. Once we've made that analysis, then it will be much easier for us to apportion the three disciplines. And so once we know what proportion the disciplines are, we need to schedule them in. So it's not just enough to know, okay, I need A, B, C in these proportions. You have to actually create time in your day, in your week, for those things. And so that's something that we'll touch on more as we go through chapter 12. So the only thing from chapter 12 that I'll touch on now is to reiterate what we were discussing at the beginning of this class, which is that the whole of spirituality is the reduction of ego and egocentric desires, selfishness. If we are doing that, then we are practicing spirituality, then we are on the path of self-development. And it functions through the principle of as you think, so you become. So through selfless action, you identify with something outside the ego. Through devotion, you identify with something outside yourself. Through knowledge, you identify with principles that underlie and that transcend you. So in all three of these channels, you're gaining the identification with the higher. Okay, have a great Sunday. Stuck in your homes for most of us. And I will see you on Monday for Vedanta Treaties, and again Thursday, Sunday.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys. Adios.
Thank you, brother Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. Hari Om.
Thank you, brother. Bye-bye.
Bye.